So Sue's got a mixture of the skills of being a very keen photographer, and you'll see her photographs around the room and you can peruse those at your leisure, as well as being an entomologist and keen on fruiting trees and others, and pollination. So those three sort of main things. So I might pass it over to you, and Sue's going to be talking about fruit tree pollination with special reference to the mango. All right, well I'll let you to fill in the many gaps that I've just given you in your introduction. So warm welcome to you, Sue. Really appreciate it.
Okay, well thank you for inviting me today. When I originally spoke on All the Dirt podcast, I was living in Perth, but was due that week to move to Katanning. So by the time I got the invitation, I'd already moved down to Katanning. And I'm now working at a nursery in Katanning, growing trees for revegetation and salt bush for farmers. And so, slight change in career. There's not much going in entomology at the moment, unfortunately, so go to the next best thing, the plants. So, 70% of all species on Earth are insects. And out of those insects, 3% of them, or less than 3% of them, are pests. However, it's a bit like a school teacher. The school teacher always remembers the naughty children first. He learns their names first. And so I'm sure that all of you have learned the names and the species of various pest species that visit your fruit trees. But that means that there's 97% or more of the visitors are not pests. They're good, beneficial insects. And so today we're going to look at some of those, and particularly those that do pollination. So, the insects that visit flowers, they do a range of ecosystem services, including pollination, which is going to be the main thing I'll talk about, biological control. Yep.
Will you take questions on the way through, Sue, or you do
at the end is probably easier. Yeah. Biological control, which is using insects to control other pest insects. Seed dispersal in fruit trees, it's probably not as common because most of the seeds tend to be larger and the insects are able to move them, but certainly on things that are small seeds. They can provide nutrients either directly. The frass of an insect is in one of the most usable forms of fertiliser that there is. So the frass is basically the poo, the excrement of the insect. And as the bodies break down, they also are really usable by plants as a fertiliser. They also do it indirectly through decomposition of plant material, carrion and dung. And all of these are waste disposal as well. So the ultimate recyclers are our insects for plants. They can also be a food source for birds, mammals, reptiles and other insects. I don't know if any of you have ever eaten insects before, but cooked okay, but they're a great protein source. When people think of pollination, most people think of the European honeybee. That's fairly standard, the thing that comes to mind first. Now this is an introduced species. It's actually feral in much of our bush, and it's certainly not the only pollinator. And on some plants, as we learned today, it's not even close to being the best pollinator. But it does have good press, people know about it. It can lead to the depletion of resources. You can see the bee at the top. It's busy breaking into an avocado flower before it has opened. So it's getting all the nectar out, but it's not contributing anything to pollination. It also forages early in the morning. The native bees, because of their size, need to warm up, so they tend to forage later, so it can lead to depletion. Now, if we have mass flowering trees like our mangoes and our avocados, this isn't an issue, but it is if you're in a small ecosystem. There are also various environments where you do not want to use honeybees. And one of those is if you're using a polytunnel, for instance. If you've got blueberries in a polytunnel and you put honeybees in there, they do not like being in a confined space, and workers are just going to get stung. And so that's an environment where you would prefer not to use a honeybee unless you have to. And with the incursion of the varroa mite into Australia, we really need to be looking at our native pollinators and what they are doing. So what then makes a good pollinator? First of all, obviously, they must feed on flowers. They can either visit the flower to feed, to sleep, or even to find a mate. They need good flower handling ability. Now we can split them into generalists and specialists. And as the name suggests, a generalist will go to a whole variety of flowers. This is a Califora albifrontalis here, and it's feeding on an avocado flower, but it will feed on a whole range of flowers. Honeybee is the ultimate generalist. You probably have seen blue-banded bees around. They're also very generalist. And there's these little tiny bees, if you want a reed bee. There's some in a box up here if you want to have a look at them later, along with a honeybee to get the size proportion. And they're generalists. We do have some specialist bees. Now this one's not on a fruit tree, it's on a banksia, because it's called the banksia bee. It specialises in banksias. And you get some insects, like some of our wasps, that specialise on only one particular species. And so it can be a very tight relationship, or it could be a slightly broader one. So the banksia, the little bees, were foraging, looking for whatever they could find in pollen and nectar on the banksia. When the banksia bee came along, it opened the stamen, and the others all came running to feed off that stamen that it had found. Now, fruit trees that are growing in Australia, the majority of them are probably not from Australia. They're probably from originating elsewhere, which means we wouldn't have the specialist insects that may be associated with those plants. So you will mostly be relying on the generalists to do your pollination. But the fortunate thing about that is a lot of the fruit tree flowers are quite open and easier to access before the generalists. The flower size and shape makes a big difference. An open or a cup flower is really easy. All the insects can access that. If it's a tubular flower, it might need a long-tongued bee or a fly that has a long proboscis, because the nectar's right at the end and there's a constriction in between. Now, some of our plants have different pollination mechanisms where a trigger has to be set to be able to release the pollen. And one group are buzz pollinators. Now, tomatoes fall in that group, but also blueberries, both of which will self-pollinate and will get pollination in the wind, but they improve if they're pollinated with buzz pollination. Now, in tomato farms, they actually go around with a hand, if they're inside a greenhouse, they go around and hand pollinate every single one with a vibration to release that pollen. But we actually have a few bees in Australia that are buzz pollinated. The bumblebee is the biggest one in Europe, but fortunately we don't have it on the mainland in Australia. But this little blue-banded bee, they're buzz pollinators. They hold onto the flower and they vibrate the thorax muscles and it releases the pollen. And there's one species, Amygdala murriensis, which is quite special. He's a head-banging bee. His head hangs off the flower, hangs off the flower, bangs a head against the flower 350 times a second, and that releases the pollen. Who would have thought playing heavy metal to your fruit trees might actually work? But we also need to look at floral fidelity. That means, does the insect go from sitting on your orange tree and then take off to a eucalypt and then come back to a daisy and go around and then eventually it'll get back to the orange tree, but it's got no orange pollen left? Or does it stick to the one type of plant and forage on that several times so that it's transferring the right pollen? This little Lasseglossum sitting on the avocado is covered in pollen. You might think, great pollination, but this was taken in Pemberton. And the season I was down there doing the surveys, it was wet and cold almost every day. And the Lasseglossum females have holes in the ground where they pack in pollen and nectar to feed their young and then lay their egg in there. The males, if it's cold, they sleep inside the sow thistles or any other flowers that close up. And so, during the day, for the first few days, we didn't even see them because they were just curled up inside their little flowers and they just couldn't be bothered getting out. Then we had a little bit of sun and a few of them came out. So this one had got onto the avocado flower, but he's covered in sow thistle pollen. So none of that is going to make any avocados at all. So it needs to have good floral fidelity. Hairiness, fairly obvious. If it's hairy, it's going to pick up more pollen. So beetles and ants, while you'll see them on your trees, the chances are they're not transferring pollen, with the exception of some beetles, like the LEL beetles have a hairy underside, and that's pretty good because they walk across the flower and they pick it up. So, but they can, some of the beetles can also actually damage the flower because they chew and they get the flowers as well. Depends on the beetle. So this little cute fluffy thing is actually a bee fly, not a bee. And anything that's got short, fluffy, soft hair, that's going to be really good at picking up fine grain pollen. So those plants that have the fine grain pollen. This one's a little confused because bee flies love blue. They come to blue flowers, and he sort of went to my number plate rather than to the flower. But yeah, so they're not, the bee flies themselves are not strongly, so I normally see them on native plants and not on it, but there is actually one species which is the main pollinator of cashews in some areas as well. So they do pollinate. But anything, the picture's really just to show a soft, hairy, good pollinator. Wasps that have long, coarse, rough hairs, they're great for picking up the larger grain pollen. And so you'll see them on various plants going around, and I've seen them on avocados, I've seen them on mango. The flower colour makes a difference. The flowers don't have colours to please us humans. The flowers have colours to attract the pollinators that they want. Now, most insects don't have a rigid, I only go to this colour, but they have a preference. So hoverflies, preference is yellow, bee flies, blues, whites, purples. Native bees tend to like whites and creams. And red is a signal to the birds to come and feed on them. The birds love the red. I rarely see it, other than honeybees and some of the little reed bees, I rarely see other insects feeding on red flowers. But they do go to a whole range of other colours. And so there are variations in the colour which attract the flower and the scents as well. And if an insect has got a scent once, if it's got a scent on a flower and at the same time it's got a really good nectar reward, as soon as it smells that scent again, it will go to the same flower. So that helps to keep that floral fidelity going from flower to flower. I studied, for my masters, I looked at mango pollination. I was in northern Queensland because I was up at Armidale in New South Wales, and so I went up to Mareeba in Queensland to do the study. So there was a different assortment of insects to what we would find in WA, but there was quite a bit of overlap still. So the first thing I did was to walk along transects, a 50-metre transect on 10 different farms, 6 times a day for 3 weeks, and counted how many, or every insect that landed on the flower during that 20-minute period. And so that was to work out, firstly, the abundance. Now, mango, an introduced crop, grown in a monoculture, and some of the farms had beehives. You would think that the honeybee numbers would be up, but they were only 13% of the business. Little Tetragonula carbonaria, which is probably the most well-known bee, that's not the honeybee. It's called the sugarbag bee or the stingless bee. It's one of the few native bees that you can actually hive. Almost all of Australia's native bees are what we call, they just collect for their own brood. They don't socialise. They're non-social bees. But then you do have some that actually build tunnels together, but even though they've got their tunnels together, they will only still have their own cells, so they'll collect food just for their own brood within that. It's sort of like an apartment block, and everyone has their own little house in it. And others have them all in the same type of area, but they've all got their own little tunnel, which is sort of like a suburb. But these ones are like the honeybees. They have a hive, they have a hierarchy, they have roles within that hierarchy. They're a bit more flexible in that it changes over time. Who takes on queen, it's not the same type of system as a honeybee, but it still is a social system. And so they can survive in a hive, and people have done that, either for honey or to help with pollination. So they was 36% of the visits. We then had the rhinidae, which are the pointy nose flies. They came in at 16%, and the hobble flies came in at 15%, all higher than the honeybee. So you can see they weren't the biggest of visitors, which shows that honeybees probably found some other food somewhere else. And I have heard people say that they put the hive on the farm and they watch them all take off into the bush because there's something much nicer out there than the mango, to the honeybee anyway. From that I could also work out not just the abundance but the diversity. How many species did we have? I counted 44 species. 25 of those were fly species, 2 of those were bee species, and then there were wasps and beetles and others. Of those 44, about 12 of them would be regarded as reasonable pollinators, in that they were regular enough in their visits and that they did transfer pollen. And so, if you have a diverse system, then in a native bush it's essential, because all of the different plants have different methods of having pollen. They need different pollinators. But in a monoculture, or often with our fruit trees where we have lots of flowers on the trees, that might not seem so important. But it helps to build stability and also resilience in a system. So if we get changes in the weather, climate change, if there's some insects will respond to that in different ways. So some insects will struggle with a change in temperature and others will cope. So if you have a wide variety, you can cope with those changes. If the varroa mite spreads in Australia, the honeybee population could be threatened, but if we have all these other species in the background doing the work, then they can start to pick up some of the other work. So that's where the stability and the resilience comes into the system. So diversity is important. Different insects have different character traits and different preferences also for where they like to forage, which part of the plant. So for instance, on a strawberry, wild bees, native bees, on the whole, like to feed on the basal stigma. Honeybees like to feed on the apical stigma. And so that means, and when a strawberry gets pollinated, it needs lots. The more times it gets pollinated, the rounder, the more perfectly symmetrical, and the larger the fruit is going to be. And so if you've got insects that like the top and others that like the bottom, then you're going to get a much nicer fruit for the Western idea of what a fruit should look like. But it can also happen on an orchard scale or a tree scale. So on avocado, I saw hoverflies up the top of the tree. We had a little fly called, this one here who's blowing a bubble on a blueberry bush. This is California dubia. It tended to like the bottom of the tree. Alba frontalis, sort of the middle of the tree, and the hoverfly, and the honeybees went everywhere. And so they would vary where they went on the tree. And they can do the same in an orchard or in a greenhouse. Some prefer the edges, some like to go further into the orchard. So, diversity also leads to competition. And competition can have positive and negative effects. So if we have insects on the tree and someone comes in, it can actually cause the other insect to move somewhere else, and that spreads them out around the tree and makes a more even spread where the fruit are on the tree, and even as the pollination. Or it could have the effect that it comes in and it takes off. It says, no, don't like this fellow, I'm going somewhere else, and takes off to a different plant. On an orchard scale, it might come in and move it to another tree. Now, if you have plants like your avocados, where you need a pollinizer and the main plant, or you have male and female plants, that could be a good thing because it can move them to different trees, and that spreads it. You get your male-female transfer. There was a study done on sunflower where they were all planted in rows of males, then females, then males and females, and introducing other species meant that the honeybee, which previously it used to just go down one row, and so it would just go male tree, male tree, male tree, with never actually going to the females, or sunflower I should say. Once they had other species there, as soon as it met something else, it crossed over to the other row, so it was actually doing a lot more effective pollination once it had competition. Or it could have the effect that it comes in and the other species says, I'm going. I've observed honeybees and native bees on plants together, and I have never seen the honeybee being aggressive towards the native bees and chasing them away. But once the numbers get to a certain balance, they might just think, no, too many here, I'm going somewhere else. There's also different traits for how they manage time or how they manage weather. So, the time of day. We all know moths come out at night, and they can be brilliant pollinators. I have no data, unfortunately, on mango because we didn't actually survey at night. But moths do pollinate lots of different things. So they're a nighttime one, where your honeybees are your daytime one. Bees, the honeybee likes to come out maybe mid-morning or relatively early morning to mid-morning. It has a little lull in the middle of the day, and then it increases again at night. In the afternoon, and that's because of the way it uses its temperature. In the heat of a day, it has trouble cooling down. So whether at the moment it can be out all day. The little native bees, however, they need to warm up, so they're the opposite. So they perform better the warmer it is. So they peak often midday to afternoon. Whereas flies are a bit more plateaued. They come out earlier than the bees. They sort of dip a little bit midday and then they come out again in the late afternoon, and they can stay quite late. So when I was doing transects, working and observing, the very last one of the day, it was normally only beetles and flies that I saw. Whereas the middle ones, I saw lots of bees as well. So they vary. So the time, as it changes through the day, you get a different group, and that can lead to an extension of your pollination. This does partly depend on your crop or your plant, because some plants have a very short period of viability for their pollen and a short period of receptivity for their stigma. And if that's the case, then you're only going to get pollination for those insects that occur during that time. Mango is one that is receptive once the flower opens, it's receptive for 3 days. So if there's moth pollination going on, it's still going to be pollinated at night. And as the temperature increases, you'll get different groups, and this helps to spread our pollination. So the two groups that I saw the most of were the Hymenoptera, which they're normally your ants, they are your ants, bees and wasps, but the bees were the most common. I did see wasps pollinating on the mango. However, you only ever I saw about 10 species, but only a couple of every single one of those species. They weren't out in big numbers. So we've got 2,000 species of bees in Australia. Now, I like to think of bees as the panda bears of the insect world. Everyone sort of comments on a bee buzzing around, busy doing its work. We all know bees. It's easy to get funding if you want to do research into bees. Butterflies are sort of the fashionistas, flitting around with their beautiful colours. We all notice them. We all like to see them. But whoever saw a fly in a TV commercial, unless it was for Mortein, they are probably the most underrated, misunderstood group of insects. But we have 120,000 species worldwide and 6,500 species in Australia. They are in every continent in the world, and they cover the full gamut of services that they provide for the ecosystem. They're amazing when you really get to know them, but we only know the couple of species that annoy us, and so they get a bad reputation. A fly has 2 wings, whereas most other insects have 4 wings. The second pair of wings being converted to halteres, which are the little lugs that you can see on the side of their body. They measure the movement in the air. So it allows the fly to climb and to bank. And the wings have like gears, so they can move independently in different things. So that's why the fly can fly. And why the fly, along with the dragonfly, are probably the 2 best groups of flyers in the world in terms of insects. The other thing, if you want to tell a fly and a bee apart, and if you do look at my insect box later, the honeybees in the middle, the 2 little ones on one side are native bees. This one here is actually a fly. It's a hoverfly, and everyone thinks it's a bee. And so the way you can tell them apart is to look at their eyes. The flies have great big bulging eyes on the side of their head, and they're separated into lots of omatidia, so that the images, thousands of images, go back to the brain. So that's why it's so hard to catch them, because they can, literally, like your mum, have eyes in the back of their head and see them. One little thing, if you want to impress your friends, if you catch a blowfly, if the eyes are close together and touching, it's a male. If they're further apart, it's a female. So you can sort of say what sex your fly is. It works with some families, not all families, but it does work with blowflies. So they start with an egg. Some species, like the dubia, actually have their eggs inside the female, and she lays live larvae. So when they come out, they're live larvae. The larva is what we call a maggot. It's the infant or the young stage of the fly. They go through instars, which is where they grow and then molt, and they, after they feed a bit more, they molt again to a bigger size. Now, your blowflies go through 3 molts in a month, and then they become an adult, or they pupate. Whereas the horseflies, the horrible ones that bite you, they go through 13 instars and take a year before they become an adult. And then there's others that are even faster than a blowfly. They then become a pupa. So if you ever see these pill-shaped things in the ground, they start pale and they go to dark. They are flies. And so they often are in the ground, in the leaf litter, in different places. Some of them are actually aquatic as well. The adult then starts to chew its way out and it actually blows its head up. It's quite groovy to look. It sort of goes up and then down and up and down until it's fully inflated. Then it pushes its way out and it starts to run. It just goes running because it hasn't got its wings inflated yet, so it's at risk. And so it just runs while it's inflating its wings until it can find a hiding place. It then comes out as an adult where it can feed, mate, and if it's female, lay eggs, and the whole thing starts again. So that's a fly. So what flies do we see on mango? The pointy-nosed fly, the Xanthogaster. We had Stormahina xanthogaster and Stormahina discolor. They were 2 very different flies, even though they're from the same family in their behaviour. When we first arrived, we actually thought discolor was a hoverfly because they were always right at the top of the mango fly, just hovering around hovering around the tree. And then when I caught some and looked at them under the microscope or looked at them under hand lens, realised it wasn't a hoverfly, it was a rhinidae, pointy-nosed fly. Whereas the other one, Xanthogaster, it spent its entire time just walking casually over the flowers, stopping and feeding, walking and stopping and feeding. It's got a very hairy underside, and it was picking up a lot of pollen and transferring it to other flowers, so it was a very good pollinator. The hoverflies, which is another really good group of pollinators, and these ones have the added benefit that their young eat aphids and other bugs, so they're good all round in all stages of their life. Aristoteles punctulatus, we have some in Perth and probably more further north, but we also have another one, Aristoteles tenax here, and I saw it on avocado, and it's a really good pollinator as well. They're actually looking at using the Aristoteles tenax in Tasmania in the production of seed for vegetable crops, because it was just so much better than the honeybee in its pollination down there. So it's a good little fly. Macimbrius is another hoverfly, and you've probably all seen hoverflies. Year before last, it was just phenomenal how many were out there. They were everywhere. Yeah. I was the secretary of WASE, the Western Australian Insect Studies Society, and you wouldn't believe how many photos we received of people saying, "What's this?" And they were hoverflies. They were absolutely, it was just a good year for them.
Just 1 week though, I found.
Yeah, it's depended where you were. I was down in Pemberton and Ruabon doing surveys on avocado, and we had 6 weeks of survey, and I was getting through that whole 6 weeks, we got up to 150 flies per tree in our counts.
in this group, I think it was our best ever avocado season.
Yeah.
The pollination was
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah, and they were just absolutely everywhere. And yes, and they're sitting there eating acorns for you as well, so that's the added benefit.
Did anyone work out why it was so many?
No, it just must have been, everything must have been right, and the right time, season before. So there must just have been
We had all that rain.
we had had lots of rain as well. And there might have been, on the trees that year, I didn't see as many of other insects. There also have been a decrease in their predators. And so that can sometimes have as much or more of an impact, that things just survive. And so, yeah, it was an amazing year. Okay, then we have our blowflies. The three that I saw on mango, or these three that I saw on mango, are probably not as good for using if you wanted to do a rearing project and actually use flies, because they do actually attack sheep. So they're the sheep blowflies. So they have a detrimental effect as well. Whereas the flies that we were seeing on avocados, the dubia and those, they're blowflies. They eat carrion, but they don't tend to attack the animals. They just tend to eat something that's already dead. And so they can actually be quite effective. And they are good pollinators. So your typical mango tree has 4,000 panicles and about 6,000, up to 4,000 panicles and up to 6,000. That's a lot of flowers, and they gradually come out into full flower. It has male and perfect flowers with 5 stamens. And so it means that the flies that walk around the tree, and they're walking around the panicle, they'll be passing both types of flowers. So they'll be able to be passing it from anther to stigma quite easily. I sat and I wanted to work out the efficiency of the insects. So identifying and knowing the pollen became quite important as it went on. As I said, the stigma is receptive for 72 hours, which is quite a long time for plants. Some of them are only 3 or 4 hours. And so what it opens hasn't got long to get pollinated, whereas this was quite long. And so there you can just see the fruit as it grows, and as you will all well be aware that there's always a lot of fruit drop, so you get the fruitlets, but then your actual final result can be less. The pollination can help. If you have good pollination, that can help to improve that. So what I did is I bagged flowers the night before. This is taken the next morning, so there is actually a few flowers open inside that, but I went round and I removed any open flowers and then put a bag over the panicle. The next morning I'd come along and I'd take off a section and I'd get an insect to land on it and feed on it. I'd then take out the stamen and make a slide of it. And then once I got back to the university, I spent months counting pollen grains. Counting how many pollen grains were transferred every time an insect visited, in a single visit to a flower. So, the highest was the native bees. The next in line were the hoverflies. The next in line were the pointy-nosed flies, and then we had the blowflies. And lagging behind was the honeybee. So you had more than double the amount of pollen transferred every time an insect visited from a native bee than you did from a honeybee. So mango's not really their big. The native bees were doing a really good job at transferring the pollen. And they were just there in the native bush. They're free. They cost you nothing. You didn't have to pay to get them to come in. And so I was surprised how low the honeybee was particularly compared to the flies in its efficiency in transferring pollen. And it was taken over 10 farms, and so they were in different habitats, and the range of insects on each farm varied greatly. Some farms were almost all flies, some farms were almost all the native bees. There was a great variation within it, and there was a variation in how far they were from the natural bushland. But it was good to see that the other insects were actually doing a really good job, even though they weren't introduced into that area. So how can you help to encourage in either your garden or your yard at home where you've got your trees, or if you're on a bigger scale also, to get these native pollinators so that they are there doing a free job for you? Firstly, chemicals, of course, is going to make a difference. A chemical is going to kill the pest, but it's also going to kill the pollinator. I think you're probably all aware of that. If you remove all of your pests, then there's no food for the larvae of these insects, of some of these insects. This doesn't apply to bees, because bees are just pollen and nectar eaters, but it does apply if you're looking at the flies and some of the beetles and others. This is actually a hoverfly larva sitting up there. It's not a caterpillar, it's a hoverfly larva munching down aphids. And so if you can find a nice balance, so you do have at least some pests, and even if you want to set up a trap crop for that, in one of the tomato farms, they were having a massive problem with spider mite, and so they grew beans all down one side. The beans grew, spider mite preferred beans to tomatoes, so they all jumped across to the beans, and as soon as they got to a certain size and it looked like they were going to move onto the tomatoes again, they removed the beans and put another lot in. So you can always just have somewhere where you have a cabbage or something where you allow the aphids and things to live on that, so that these insects can still find their food. And a lot of them are the tachinid flies, which I haven't touched on today, but they're a fly with a bristly bottom, and they're also good pollinators. And their young are parasitoids of a whole range of insects, but they're caterpillars and things like that. Now, native bees, 70% of them make their nests in the ground. So having some bare patches around is good. If your whole yard is lawn, they hate that, and you won't have any native bees around, because you mow, and unless your lawn is got lots of weeds in it, which they will like because it's got flowers, the lawn itself doesn't have other flowers. In your garden, if everything is mulched, there's nowhere to dig. You don't need, and it's good to keep mulching, but just leave some of your yard where there's bare patches, and then they can nest there. Others like to nest into mud bricks, so even just an old brick stood on its side and things like that, or bits where it's slightly muddier, they like that. This one here that you can see down here, I actually got a call to go down to Bridgetown, sorry, I moved this. Got a call to go down to Bridgetown. This farmer said, you need to come and look at this. We've got pollen wasps, well, he didn't know them at the time, but we identified them as pollen wasps down there. They eat the pollen from some of the corymbia trees. He had a 2-acre property, and there was no patch of ground where there was dirt where you couldn't walk without stepping on a wasp nest. We estimated close to 1 million wasps on his property for a 2-week period. That sounds scary, but it was quite fascinating for an entomologist. And there was another species of wasp that was, as soon as these ladies went in, they laid their eggs, and then they'd go to get some more food, and another wasp would sneak in and lay its eggs as well. And when its eggs hatched, they ate the food that had been provided by the first wasp, by this black and white wasp. So there was a whole ecosystem going on down there, but they do like to make their nests in the ground. Other bees and some wasps like to make their nests in old stems. So if you've got plants, anything, your agapanthus, your kangaroo paw, that type of stem, so a soft stem, they drill a hole and they make their nests inside, and the men hang off grass stems or old stems to roost at night. And so if you're constantly wanting a super tidy garden and pulling all of that out, you could be removing any of the young. Even just putting some and stacking them to the side means that they're still there. So they don't have to be in the middle of your beautiful garden, they can be out the side. But the most important thing is to have diversity in your yard. If you've got a range of different fruit trees and other plants as well, then there's different flowering seasons, and so there's food all year. If you include a range of colours, not just red for your thing, but a lot of colours, and fruit trees a lot of them are whitish or pinkish, which is perfect for the insects, and so it's great for attracting them. And some local plants helps to, I guess, just that they survive well. And they attract the native insects because they're the ones that they know in that area. So next time you're looking at one of your fruit trees and you see bees on it, looking for pollinators, don't just look for the honeybees, but look for all of the range of insects that might be visiting your thing. Some of them are tiny, some of them are quite large. Some of them might just be there, like, have I got one in there? It'll be on the next one. And think of the flies as well. So some of them, like, this one here, is sitting there to catch any pests that come around as well. It's a robber fly, and so it eats other insects. It's a bit like your praying mantis. And so they all have a use, they all have a purpose. So if you see a fly in your house, rather than swatting it or reaching for the mortine, chase it outside to your whatever tree you have, and it might help you get more fruit. So thank you for listening.
Just wondering, from the design point of view, if you just say if you have let's just say 4 acre block, you've got your orchard, veggies, would you be likely to want to plant natives? Obviously, it depends on rooting and the rest of it, but would you, if you planted a more perimeter planting of natives, vines, trees, that sort of thing, would you then try and encourage more of that native growth in the middle of your garden, or just in case they would just stay on the perimeter and not pollinate your fruit trees? Would that be something to consider, or doesn't matter?
You could do either. It would really more be preference for how, and for the different needs of the plants. Like if you're watering, a lot of natives don't like too much water, and if you're watering your fruit trees a lot more, they might not like that, the plants. But you'll tend to find, I found that any orchard that was, or any orchard that had native bush 50 metres away, had a lot more pollinators, diversity of pollinators. So they still came in, even though there was a distance.
So they're not just going to stick to their kind?
No, they don't. Yeah.
They'll go.
It depends on a lot of factors, and some insects will and some won't. So like the honeybees, if they had an option of a flowering marry, they went to the marry rather than coming to the mango. But if it's in another orchard, like avocado, they'll come into the avocado rather than going to the mango. So it's a preference of what they see. But
so you mentioned the wasp, and
then Lisa, after Guy, then Lisa.
sorry. So you mentioned the wasp and how to encourage the wasp. Was that correct in understanding that providing clay enables more wasps to lay their eggs and form nests under the ground?
quite a few wasps, like we've got a whole group of wasps that are mud dormers.
Yeah.
And they'll actually lay it and attach it to your building and things like that. They'll grab the mud and they'll make it.
So I'm on the sand because I'm in Florida. So if I dumped a bag of clay somewhere, that would help increase the wasps in the area?
It could, but it could also increase some bees. The blue-banded bee, it's a mud, it digs into mud.
Okay.
And it'll, like, if you have a soft brick wall, it can actually get into that as long as the bricks are soft. Or if you have a mud panel, it can get into it. So you could even get bees as well as wasps through that.
I could just talk. I just wanted to ask, what kind of carrying off from him, that what sort of soil would be better for the pollinators? Sand, loam, mud, clay, or does it just depend on where you live?
It depends species and species, and it depends where you live. They're not as dependent on the type of soil as to what else is around. As long as they can actually dig into it. But having said that, there's this little absolutely beautiful patch of bush on the edge of Collie, between Collie and Worsley, called Westralia National Park, Conservation Reserve. And it's all native, not fruit, obviously, but there's these sand wasps, and it's just like rock hard there, and they just seem to dig into it and still do it. But yes, certainly if it's slightly softer, and they will use sand, and of course sand wasps will use sand. So sandy, and I know people around Perth, up in the hills, and people closer to the coast, who have actually had native bees in their yard making holes. And so they seem to be quite variable in that, as long as they can actually have them, as long as it's soft enough at some stage for them to be able to dig.
So it's not worth bringing things in, just leave bare patches where you live.
Yeah, that's fine. You do. So,
Don't try to bring sand in and bring clay.
yeah, no, it would work either way. And you'll be they don't fly massive distances, and so they need to be in your area. Like if they were in your area, then they're obviously used to that type of soil, but it will just bring them into your yard a bit more. Yeah.
Thank you, Sue. That was great, and so was your podcast too. I just got a quick question on, you said leave bare soil. Is it better to be leaving that bare soil in shady patches or sunny patches?
A bit of both, but yes, they do some shade is a bit of protection. The mother will have put in some type of material and then laid eggs and put in pollen or nectar, depending on their preference, into the holes. Have any of you seen leafcutter bees flying around? They actually, and have you got roses with holes? They cut a perfect disc out of the rose. They'll do it out lots of things. Down south, when I mentioned that they don't notice it in the rose, they notice it in another plant. But they then fly off with that and they actually put that into the nest. They put pollen and nectar in it, wrap it up like a parcel and lay the egg into that. And so they do protect within it, so they do have some shade. But where these wasps were in Bridgetown, I was there on a day when it was 30 plus, and I was baking. Like I was burning every time I sat down on the ground to try to take a photo of one of them. And so the soil was super hot. The day was super hot, the ground was hot, and there was no shade, and they'd still built their nest there. But on a farm, one of the avocado farms, all of their native bees were in sort of an embankment just outside of where the trees were planted, and it was quite soft soil in the shade. So either works.
I've got one. Just on the subject of putting some clay down, because everybody knows how much I love clay. But it is actually worth putting half a bucket of some regular clay down in your garden somewhere where it gets a bit of retic on it, because you'll find that the wasps will come. And I always say, build it and they'll come. So, but my question was more about those native bees that live in a hive that you were talking about. Do they live this far south? No. How far? What's their most southern?
Yeah. Well, Tetragonella carbonaria, which was the one that I observed, is not even in WA. It's Queensland down to Sydney. We do have a related species, another Tetragonella, but not carbonaria, in the Kimberleys. But I'm not sure how far down it does.
Is that marinara, is it?
Yeah. Carbonaria, sorry. I don't even know what the species is. So I don't know how big its range is and how it's spread and how far it is. But there is one in WA, but there's not one that I know of in Perth. There's a website called iNaturalist. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's designed for citizen science and for mapping species across the world. And people can put up a photo of anything that they've seen, and other people jump on and say what it is. But it's one where I did some mapping by putting in a species and seeing what plants it was on and where it's been recorded in WA. It doesn't work as well for the flies because people are so if you're doing it for birds or for mammals, it's brilliant because everyone notices those, but people don't always notice the little fly that's sitting on their flower, and unless they're like me, they probably don't stop and take a photo of it. And so it's sort of got the data's warped or changed, it's biased towards the things that people like taking photos of. But it's a good website to sort of say, okay, has anyone seen this species near me? And you can just put in your area and work out what's around and see who's observed what in your area. And that will give you an idea of what type of species are out there and which ones then you might be able to attract. iNaturalist, yes.
Michael Crone?
Given the huge potential of those native insects compared to some fruit trees like avocado, mango, how easy is it to raise those insects, to release them to the thousands rather than waiting for the bushland for them to migrate to the orchards?
That's a really good question. There's actually a pollination project that I was in for 2 years. Unfortunately, the funding didn't extend for me for the next year, but it's being done in 5 different groups across Australia, and the idea was to look at what flies can be used for pollination, and then once the flies are selected, Biological Services, which is a group that's got an office here, or an insectary here, and another one in South Australia. I worked in the South Australian one for 8 months. They're actually going to then try to raise the flies. So when I worked on it, we did some avocado tests and we did some blueberry tests, and we were raising blowflies. And so if it's a blowfly, they're super duper easy to raise in really large numbers. You just have to pick the right blowfly so that you're not releasing things that are going to be a nuisance. Bees are a little bit trickier unless they're like the stingless bees. So people hive the stingless bees, so they're good. But when you've got solitary bees, it's a lot harder to raise that because each one just has 1 or 2. Where a fly, you can start with a couple of flies and end up with a couple of 100 flies very quickly. Whereas with the bees, you're only ever going to get 2 or 3 at the most out of each generation. You often only end up with 1 in the wild, 1 or 2 in the wild because of the fact that there's predation. But when you're raising them, you don't have that problem. But yeah, so it depends on the insect. The hoverfly is probably one that could be done. The Eristalis tenax, which is related to that one with the funny eyes that I saw. I haven't actually put a picture up on that board, but there'll be one on one of the boards around with the photos. It's called the rat-tailed maggot fly, and so it basically lays its larva in water that's not always completely clean, and it eats the detritus in the water, so that type of thing's quite easy to raise. And at Biological Services, we were raising parasitic wasps. My PhD, I looked at doing whitefly on tomato plants and used 2 different parasitic wasps, both of which are less than 1 millimetre long, so they're tiny little things, and looked at how they interacted in controlling whitefly. And I raised them quite easily. You just had to make sure you keep a tomato plant and some whitefly and keep your balance right of your numbers. But so hoverflies certainly are definitely feasible to raise. The native bees would take a lot more work, I think.
So I might ask a question, and then Yong. Are there any insects out there that are okay to kill? I'm thinking of having been attacked by a swarm of European paper wasps one time. I hate them. Do they do any good, or is it okay because they get under your eaves and you can spray them quite easily if you want to?
You can kill as many European paper wasps as you want because they're not natives.
But do they help in pollination?
They would do a little bit in pollination. Almost a whole stack of avocado trees actually had European wasp nests in them. But I didn't see them. I saw them a little bit on flowers, but they're not as hairy as some of our native species, and so they wouldn't be transferring as much. The best thing that they're doing is keeping other pests at bay, because they're food source.
Such as?
They probably eat a wide range. I'd have to check up on this. I'm not 100% on that one, but I think caterpillar type things. Whereas you've probably seen those big black and orange wasps around. They actually pack. If you break open one of their nests, inside it will be packed with spiders. They're little full of spiders. So a lot of the muddaugers go for spiders. So yes, but a lot of the wasps, particularly the parasitoid wasps, the native ones, they lay eggs in caterpillars. And so the moths that then attack crops, and they're the ones that are most stubborn, because if it attacks an economic crop, then people put time into learning it. And so some of the tachinid flies are also good with that. The two that I think most people ask about and that I still have to work out a good answer to is mosquitoes or horseflies.
Go on.
Yeah, so very interesting presentation. Some of us grow cactus, dragon fruit. Suddenly I go like dragon fruit. And dragon fruit are known to flowers only at night. So, are you aware of or know of any good pollinators that come out to pollinate the flowers at night?
Yes, the moths do a fabulous job in pollination, but there's not a lot written on it because most researchers don't want to spend all their nights out in the bush, and it's a lot harder to do a survey at night. But you'll find that moths will be pollinating it. Yeah.
I think the problem with the moths is that they don't have the right sort of size. Separation between the anthers and the stigma.
Okay.
It's enormous distance.
Okay, so you're going to, dig into it. Okay.
Just a related question about the dragon fruit. Is there any way of attracting the moths to the dragon fruit at night time? Like a light source or something?
Light source would work.
Yeah.
Yeah, they'd come into that, particularly a black light rather than a
Black
white
light.
light.
That's a UV light.
UV light, yeah. That's when we're doing biodiversity surveys at night. I do light trapping. I'm actually going to do one in Ravensthorpe in a month's time, and I put a black light with a mosquito net tent over the top of it, and they all come and they come and they land on it. We can observe what species come, so that will work.
Derek?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. That's a great talk. I knew about the phase pollination for tomatoes, but the bluebirds I didn't know about.
Nor did I until very recently.
So we've had bluebird bees visit a few of them in on orange flowers daily, just only in this last year. And I was looking at making mud bricks basically to see if I can make a home for them and attract more, and now I'm even more motivated to do that. I've seen like in Bunnings and places you can get sort of the nest a whole pile of cylindrical tubes of all different sizes. Do they work?
That's a really good question, and I probably should have mentioned something like that in that last slide that I did. The concept is fantastic and they do work, but my note of caution, when they first came out and it became the thing to do, people started thinking bigger is better, and they just got bigger and bigger. But most of our native bees, for those who haven't seen them, they're called an insect hotel. Most of our native bees, as I said, are solitary, and diseases can transfer from one species to another. So if you have this massive hotel with lots of different options, you'll get someone colonising it, but you won't get variety because they don't want to make their nests that close together. The clue is to get several little ones or lots of little ones and space them apart. And the other thing that some of the bought ones aren't good at are keeping the rain off. So they need a big enough cover over the top of them that they protect them from the rain and from the sun. So you can literally just, down in Katanning, the Eco Centre in Katanning, they've actually just made, they get a bundle of bamboo stalks or a piece of wood that's got several holes drilled on it, put a string around it and hang it up in a tree. And they just put these things in different spots. And they're really good because they're just about 6 or 7 different shape, different size bamboo things in different spots. So if you spread them around and don't expect them all to come to the same one, they're really good. I actually want to make up one that's got opens like a book and has perspex down the side, so that the holes are drilled so that you can see through the perspex, so you can actually open it up and look at the nests and see how they go.
Time for one more question from anyone? Yeah, Rose.
Can you share the slideshow?
Okay.
Brilliant talk, so knowledgeable. Do you think that, given that the European honeybee is, large hives, and you may not have deliberately sort of brought in a hive, it just happens to be one in the neighbourhood somewhere, that the sheer numbers that they can sort of produce and bring to your sort of yard might offset the fact that, there's this one native bee or native insect that might be out there. So is it underrating a little bit the honeybee in that we know that it's not sort of the natural or the most efficient pollinator, but sheer numbers. I think the dragon fruit that sort of Guy talked about, I mean, I think we've all seen early in the morning or late at night when those flowers are open, you can have 40 bees clambering, competing with one another all over in one fly. And so even though they may not sort of deliberately sort of go for this or that, just the sheer competition means that they do some pollination.
Oh, and there's some crops that would exist that we wouldn't have without, like the almond industry. Without honeybees, we wouldn't have an almond industry because the amount of pollination they need, they're basically sapping all the avocado farmers were complaining last year because, when I was in South Australia for a few months, and nothing could compete with the amount the almond industry paid to get hives on their property because they so needed it. And it's the same in America, and it's probably the biggest cause of spreading of varroa mite in America was because so many, almost all hives end up going where the almond industry is. But there's certainly a whole range of crops and plants that without the honeybee, we wouldn't have. So I'm not saying the honeybees aren't important, they're very, very important, but it's good to consider the others as well.
I think it's the saving grace, isn't it, for
Yeah.
most of us in the metro area.
Yeah.
We don't have a hive, but there is one somewhere within sort of flying distance, and that sort of finds your plants and does the job.
And if you look at your honeybees, the darker the honeybee, the more chances it's one that's from a feral tribe, a feral group that's gone into the bush somewhere. Because the honeybee people think that, I've been told, the paler gives a better honey. And so they breed for paleness. And so the really dark honeybees are probably from a feral group that's around. And the only thing I would say is that, yes, I would encourage people that if you want to hive, to hive for honeybees because you've got them there, but just make sure you learn about doing it the right way. Because there are species that are threatened in our bush because of the honeybee. And they're only in our bush because they were once in someone's hive and conditions weren't right. So they've taken off and they've gone to the bush. Anyone who earns their money from raising honeybees, either for honey or for pollination, they are going to look after their hives really, really well because that's their living. And so it's often, if someone takes it up as a hobby and has it, but doesn't learn properly how to do it, that's when we end up with feral hives in the bushland. And it's good to avoid that, but you can't be a managed hive, managed well, will do amazing things for your trees.
Thank you very much. That was a really fascinating talk. I think the number of questions that you got showed the interest in it, and the fact that you can illustrate it so beautifully with your photography is a real sort of boon. So,
and my apologies for the ones that were for the posters around native rather than fruit trees.
but feel free to have a look around. There's some props out the front. There's some books to look at. There's many photos around the place. Hopefully, Sue will be able to join us for lunch, and you can ask us some further questions over that time. But as a token of our appreciation, we are going to present something to you. So Zetchi is going to talk about this plant because we were trying to find a plant that would be suitable for a pot for Catania, knowing that you're renting down there and it's a climate that perhaps not amenable to.
And one little fit in my little
yes,
car.
Yes.
I didn't think your car was too small, so I bought a rather sizable pot. That'll fit. This is the red center lime, which is a hybrid between the finger lime and the mandarin. So when it's in full fruit, it looks like a Christmas tree. All these beautiful red bubbles hanging on it. It's grafted onto normal citrus rootstock. So if you can grow an orange tree, you can grow this one. And this was given to us by one of our members who can't be here today. So he asked me, Matt Rutherford asked me to come and deliver this, and here it is. And this is for you, and we say thank you very much. And every time this one has got the fruit on, we'll know that some of the insects that you spoke about have done their work here.